Assalamu alaikum, dear students. This is our sixth lesson of history. Book is Understanding History Book 1, and as our revision week, we are going to revise chapter number 2, Ancient Egypt of Pharaoh. Learning objectives are, by the end of lesson, students will revise the topic and subtopics of Ancient Egypt of Pharaoh. Subtopics which we are going to revise are the importance of River Nile, administration under the Pharaoh, hieroglyphs, the symbols, the pyramids, and pages which we are going to revise from 6 to 9. So let's revise our topic. Nearly 5,000 years ago, an ancient civilization, a very old civilization, existed along the river Nile in Egypt, just as the Indus Valley civilization existed around the river Indus. So a very old civilization existed, and we already know that most of the civilization grew along the rivers near the water. The river Nile is nearly 4,000 miles long and is the longest river in the world. So river Nile is the longest river of the world. The White Nile rises from Lake Tanganyika in southeast Africa and runs south to north through Tanzania, Uganda, and Sudan, where it is joined by Blue Nile, which rises from Lake Tana in Ethiopia. So, river Nile has two parts, White Nile and Blue Nile. The delta of Nile is on Mediterranean Sea. It means river fall into Mediterranean Sea. The Nile is flanked by deserts on both east and west in the north, and there are forests, grasslands, and highlands in the south. Here you can see a map, the Nile Valley. The fertile irrigated area on either side of the river Nile is shown within the dotted lines you can see on the map. Why river Nile is so important for Egyptians? Let's have a look on it. Ancient Egyptians found many uses for the river Nile. When spring came around, the water ran down the mountains and flooded Nile and surrounding areas, and when it receded, it left fertile soil on the banks where the ancient Egyptian grew crops. River Nile brought fertile alluvium with it and spread on the land, and which were very helpful for Egyptians, old Egyptians. The river also provided them with fresh water for drinking and bathing, and it was also used for transportation and goods, making trade flourish. Along the shore of the Nile grew a reed-like plant called papyrus, which was used for making paper. The river banks provided materials for building. Cotton and flax were grown for cotton fabric and linen. The people enjoyed a prosperous lifestyle because of the Nile. Egyptians were mostly priests, scribes, craftsmen, and farmers. Even today, the best cotton is cultivated in the valley of Nile. Let's have a look on administration system of pharaohs. The ruler of Egypt was called the Pharaoh, and he owned everything in the land. He was helped by an organized army, a police force, and a huge number of ministers and government officials to run the country. The Pharaoh had a vizier or prime minister who reported to him daily on what was happening all over Egypt. The Wazir was also the Chief Justice, and people came to him if the lower courts could not handle their problems fairly. The system of government carried on successfully for hundreds of years, but we also hear of cruel and harsh rulers among them. On your screen, you're watching statues of Ramesses II and other pharaohs at the temple of Abu Simbel. The ancient Egyptians were polytheists, worshipping many gods. Poly mean many, theist believers. Uh, they had nearly 2000 gods and goddesses who usually had animal heads. Temples were built to worship them, and the space was used for other purposes too, such as school for children and for gatherings and festivals by the people. You can say that temples were a community center on that time. Let's talk about hieroglyphs. The Egyptians called hieroglyphs the words of God. As these were used primarily by the priest, these painstakingly drawn symbols were great for decorating the walls of temples too. Hieroglyphs are written in rows or columns and can be read from left to right or from right to left. The direction in which the text is to be read is defined by the direction of the human or animal's figure that always face the beginning of the line. The upper symbols are read before the lower ones. Egyptian civilization came to be known for its writing as they wrote everything down and kept records. They used papyrus as well as the temple and pyramid walls for writing. At first, they used pictures known as hieroglyphs, but it took too long to write like that, so they created a new form of writing called demotic, coming from the spoken language. Archaeologists have discovered how to read demotic writing but could not read the hieroglyphs till the Rosetta Stone was discovered in 200 years ago. It had the same story written on it in Greek, demotic, and hieroglyphs. Scholars and experts thus managed to read the pictures writing from and to decipher the hieroglyphs. Did you know the Rosetta Stone was found in Egyptian village of Reshida near the Nile Delta in 1799 by French soldiers fighting there? It is now kept in British Museum in London. It helped in deciphering the written language hieroglyphics. Papyrus is thick paper-like material produced from the pith inner side of the papyrus plant, which grew in abundance in the Nile Delta of Egypt. Papyrus is first known to have been used in ancient Egypt, but it was also used throughout the Mediterranean region. Ancient Egyptians used this plant as a writing material and also for boards, mattresses, mats, ropes, sandals, and baskets. Papyrus was first manufactured in Egypt as far as back as 3000 BCE. It is made from the stem of the papyrus plant by cutting out the sticky fibrous pith in long strips, soaking it, and then pressing it down and gluing it in two layers to make a thick paper. Its use in Egypt continued until it was replaced by more inexpensive paper introduced by Arabs. And did you know the word mummy came from Arabic word mumia from corpses? The pyramids, they are considered as one of the wonder of the world. People today are fascinated by the temples and pyramids of ancient Egypt. The sheer size and the precision of their construction is amazing, especially because they were built at a time when people did not have the machines as we have now to help in completing the buildings. As we are having skyscrapers and we get help from heavy machinery, but they were not having, and they constructed the pyramids. The Egyptian believed in a life after death and prepared for it physically as well as spiritually. Pyramids, which are counted as one of the seven wonders of the world, are the huge tombs built by pharaohs for themselves. The Egyptians used the art of mummification for their dead. The bodies were carefully wrapped up in cloth bandages to preserve them. The huge tombs also carried goods including grains and honey, which they might need in afterlife. They also made models of objects of everyday life to bury with them, such as toys, clothing, and jewelry. The pharaohs and their relatives were the best preserved, and the most famous mummies are those of pharaohs Tutankhamun, Seti I, and Ramesses II. The picture which you are watching on your screens is Khafre pyramid is guarded by a sphinx, a mythical creature with a lion's body and a large human head, carved from a mound of natural rock at Giza. On your screens you are watching Egyptian system of counting. How they count? The Egyptian invented the decimal system of counting. They used 7 different symbols. 1 was represented by a single stroke. 10 was shown by drawing 1 hobble. 100 was shown by drawing 1 coil of rope. 1000 was represented by drawing of 1 lotus plant. 10,000 was shown as 1 finger. 1 lakh or 100,000 was represented by drawing of 1 frog. A hieroglyphic image of 6 frogs in a row would mean 600,000, and 100,000 was represented by the figure of God with raised arms. Next you will watch a video that will recapture or revise all your concepts again.
Hi there, my name is John Green, and this is Crash Course World History. Today we're going to talk about Egypt. No, not that Egypt. Older, less fictional. Yes, that one. Ancient Egypt is probably the most influential of the River Valley civilizations. Like, you may not recognize any Assyrian kings or Assyrian language, but you probably do know King Tut, and you may recognize that the Eye of Horus is right now staring at me and judging me. I can feel your judgment. When we think of ancient civilizations, we think of Egypt. There are a few reasons for this, like the fact that the pyramids are the last man standing among the 7 ancient wonders of the world. But more importantly, ancient Egyptian civilization lasted from 3000 BCE to 332 BCE. That's a period that historians call a long-ass time. And I will remind you, it is not cursing if I'm talking about donkeys. So there are many approaches to the study of history. You can view history as a millennia-long conversation about philosophy, or as clashes between great men, or you can see history through the lens of traditionally neglected populations like women, or indigenous peoples, or slaves. And we're going to try to take many approaches to our study of history during Crash Course. Discussing agriculture and early River Valley civilizations, we've been approaching history through the lens of resource distribution and geography. And just as the violent and capricious Tigris and Euphrates rivers shaped the worldview of early Mesopotamians, the Nile shaped the worldview of the Egyptians. Let's go to the thought bubble. The Nile was regular, navigable, and benign, making for one of the safest and richest agricultural areas in the world. Each summer, the river flooded the fields at precisely the right time, leaving behind nutrient-rich silt for planting season. Planting was so easy that Egyptians just tossed seeds around the silty earth and then let their cattle or pigs walk on it to press the seeds into the ground, and then boom, grain and figs and wheat and pomegranates and melons and joy. Unlike most River Valley civilizations, Egyptian communities existed only along the Nile. which was navigable enough to get valuable resources downstream from timber to gold, which the Egyptians considered the divine metal, thereby introducing an idea that would eventually culminate in Mr. T. The Nile was also easily tamed. While other river valley civilizations needed complicated and labor-intensive hydraulic engineering projects to irrigate crops, the Nile was so chill that Egyptians could use a simple form of water management called basin irrigation, in which farmers used floodwaters to fill earthen basins and canals for irrigation. In short, the awesomeness of the Nile meant Egyptians could create big food surpluses with relatively little work, allowing time and energy for some pretty impressive projects. Also, the Nile may help explain ancient Egypt's general optimism, this gloomy, dark place. Egyptians were often buried with things that were useful and pleasurable to them in life, because the afterlife was seen as a continuation of this life, which, at least if you lived along the Nile, wasn't half bad. Thanks, Thought Bubble. And now, my dear pupils, I shall terrorize you with the oppression of dates. No, dates. Yes, thank you. Historians have divided Egyptian history into three broad categories, each with their own numbered dynasties. But only hardcore Egyptologists know the dynasties, and we're not trying to become hardcore Egyptologists. The Old Kingdom lasted from 2649 to 2152, the Middle Kingdom from 2040 to 1640, and the New Kingdom, so-called because it is only 3,000 years old, lasted from 1550 to 1070 BCE. In between, you have a couple so-called intermediate periods. Okay, Old Kingdom. This was really the glory age of ancient Egypt, when you got all the stuff that would later make Indiana Jones possible, like the pyramids at Giza and the Sun King Ra and the idea of divine kingship. The king, or pharaoh, was either a god or very close to a god, which seems like a good gig, except that it meant he wasn't expected to act like a person, he was expected to act like a god, which in ancient Egypt means acting like the Nile. Calm, cool, benevolent. There's no fun in that. And then, of course, there are the pyramids, which, aside from remaining impressive to behold, represent a remarkable degree of political and social control over the population, because it is not easy to convince people to devote their lives to building a sarcophagus for someone else. The most famous pyramids were built between 2575 and 2465 BCE. The one with the Sphinx was built for Khephren. The largest, the Great Pyramid, was built for the pharaoh Khufu. The pyramids were built partly by peasants who were required by Egyptian law to work for the government a certain number of months per year, and partly by slaves, but not by Moses and the Jews, who showed up on the scene long before the pyramids were ever even a twinkle in Khufu's eye. This leads to an overwhelming question. Why? Why, in the sweet name of Ra, would anyone ever build such a thing? Well, let's start with Ra. So Ra started out as a regional god reigning over Heliopolis, but he eventually became really central to the entire pantheon of gods in ancient Egypt. He was the god of the sun, but also the god of creation. And the thinking was that if humans did their jobs, then the pantheon of gods would maintain cosmic order. And since the pharaohs became gods upon their death, it made sense to please them, even unto pyramids. Egyptian popular religion also embraced the belief in amulets and magic and divination, and the belief that certain animals, especially cats, had divine power. And yes, I did bring that up just so I could lolcat. Old Kingdom Egypt was also remarkably literate. They had two forms of writing, hieroglyphics for sacred writing, and then demotic script for recording contracts and agreements and other boring stuff. The last thing I want to say about Old Kingdom Egypt, it was ridiculously rich. But then, around 2250 BCE, there were a series of droughts and pharaohs started fighting over who should have power, and we had an intermediate period.
So at the end of revision of this lesson, here's your assignment. Question number 1. How was the river Nile useful for the people of Egypt? Question number 2. What is papyrus and what is it made from?